We're very fortunate to have Athman Ali with us today, who has extensive experience of working in East and West Africa and more recently in Indonesia. So welcome, Athman.
Thank you, Mark.
Could you just give us a little bit of quick background of your career today?
Okay, thank you, Mark. Pleasure being here. So I'm a computer scientist and engineer by background, but I've been working in development for about 19 years now. Different areas, trade facilitation, transport facilitation, poverty eradication, and improvements in basic services, particularly on health, education, and birth certificates. Currently, I am the Director for Strategy, Innovation and Performance at COMPAC, which is an Australia-Indonesia government partnership around three results areas, which is improvements in basic services, health, education, legal identity, implementation of the village law and community-led development, as well as of creation of farm jobs. So my experience has been very varied. I mean, I've worked for different types of organizations. I've worked from the donor space, I've worked for intergovernmental organizations, I've worked for managing contractors like I am now, I've worked for programs that are linked directly to donor organizations, and I've worked for organizations that are purely government as well.
There's a lot of talk now around complex problems and new programs and ways of working with complex problems. Governments often frame complex problems as a wicked problem. When government is using this term wicked problem, what do you think they're actually meaning?
In my view, I think the context would be where a number of different government and non-government entities have to interact to find a solution that could be very elusive. I mean, every time you think you've got it, you have to do something extra. And this is something that's quite normal in the context of policy dialogue and policy issues towards resolving social problems that I find in different countries that I've worked in. So when you ask me about what a government would mean when they say they have a wicked problem, it's probably a problem of that nature, where it's very hard to understand their different possible point of views on the resolution of that particular problem, different vested interests that are often competing and not complementing. And the solution is not a one-shot solution by any extent. You have to keep working at it. A good example would be, policy discussions around poverty reduction, for example. That's a big one. I would think a government would consider a wicked problem.
Some people say that wicked problems, they're resistant to solutions, and in fact, attempts to solve them often lead to more problems. They make the original problem more complex.
I would agree, but it also depends on what level of a problem you're looking at. Picking up from the example I've just given you, poverty reduction is a way, way high level problem that you have to solve. There are quite a number of root causes that are basically causing poverty. So when you're looking at it from the context of a government, the government ministry or department that you're standing in will define how you approach that particular problem. If it's an issue around social development, then possibly the ministry in charge of that would look at it from the social development point of view. If it's the Ministry of Trade, for example, they would look at it from the point of view of how do we encourage more trade, inter-regional and international, for the benefit of its citizens. And each one of these basically breaks down the bigger level problem into smaller level problems that then you can apply various methodologies to identify what the root causes are and then attempt the solutions at the root causes rather at the blanket problem statement.
But what we know from complex problems is that they can't be broken up into smaller parts, and certainly not to parts that align with ministerial portfolios or the mission statements of NGOs, that you can only really consider them as a complex system.
No, I agree with that completely, and that's the theory behind it, right? But when we look at the real world and we talk about a problem, we're talking about where the shoe pinches, right? And that's where you need to find the immediate solution. So government ministries do have priorities, and those priorities can be informed by specific problems that need to be solved at the moment. And if the focus is put on those kind of problems, I think it might be easier to find solutions to what we consider complex, wicked issues. So, for example, going back to the poverty alleviation aspect, if we consider the context of Indonesia, where decentralization has just happened, and there's a lot of funding coming from the central government all the way to the village level to spur development at the village level, the problem then becomes about how do we get that money to the village level, right, as part of this complex solution that we're looking for. But also, what are the priority issues? What are the problems being felt at each individual village that the village governments, the sub-district government, the district government need to focus all their efforts on to actually try and resolve? And thinking about it that way stops us from, being befuddled at this broader, big, complex, wicked problem that no one can solve, and rather to focus on specific issues that then NGOs can direct their mandate on, government ministries can put their priorities on, and the community can actually put in their bits as well to find a solution to that.
Would you say that complex problems are usually accompanied with a degree of institutional complexity with multiple organisations and government departments working on them? And if so, why is that?
I think in my experience, it's almost always been that way, right? Partly it's because of what you touched on earlier, right? The way the mandate is structured is very siloed, right? So Ministry X can only do Y, Ministry Z can only do, W. And sometimes the two ministries, it's not very clear how the mandate is linked. And to do cross-coordination in government is very difficult for many reasons. Enabling environment might not be there, the legal framework does not allow. And when you add in non-government actors, right? Private sector, the speed at which they move on solutions is much faster than government. That creates another dynamic. You've got civil society who are looking at it from the point of view of holding governments accountable almost always, and NGOs who are very limited in how they operate. So you've got organizations that work on a bilateral government-to-government arrangement. You've got some which only work at regional level. We've got some which can only do grants. You've got some which can do other kinds of support. So all this complexity in terms of the players and the environment creates, I would say, the missed opportunity of having, a focused way of looking at resolving some of these issues, because everyone is coming at it from their own different understanding and their own different direction. And this often leads to crowding of solutions, because different solutions starts popping up depending on the different tools and mechanisms that different actors have at their disposal.
Do you think all this crowding of solutions is partly a function that things are tried, and because complex problems are resistant to efforts to solve them, especially if they're predetermined solutions, do you think that this then leads to this dynamic where the government or the NGO tries something different? So you have this kind of a driver of sending more programs and more organisations in to work on complex problems.
I would agree on that. I think part of the issue on why you have the crowding happening is because also of the nature of the complexity of the problem, right? Remember that all the government ministries and departments and the NGOs and all the players trying to find a solution are also being held accountable to results, for example. And this creates the tendency to then focus on aspects of the complex wicked problem that catch the best traction. And often, all roads lead to the same section of the problem which catches the best traction. And this could be because of various reasons. Maybe you have a good champion who's pushing for reform in a certain policy area within the government, or the government has resourced a very specific intervention and program. So you find that all the solutions then tend to gravitate towards the path of least resistance, right? And this also, I think, in my experience, creates the crowding in. It's very rare to find organizations that dare to do the really challenging parts of the complex issue, even if it's a priority and required because of the fear of failure, right? So that also, in my experience, leads to the crowding in.
So complex problems are complex enough, but now we have this additional institutional layering and all these different organisations that are often crowding in. So you have this additional complexity within all of these institutions that we have to deal with.
Yes. And various mechanisms have been tried in so many ways. For example, I'm sure you heard of donor coordination mechanisms, government trying to basically define the priority areas and apportion different areas where the inputs should fall into, trying to set priorities. But then again, this always changes because nothing is permanent in government, right? Leaders change, champions get moved around. So what works this year might all work the next year. You've got different mandates from the donors themselves who fund the NGOs that are working on specific problems, shifting and changing, right? The focus for the US, for example, on development is definitely changing right now as we speak. What does that mean for the activities that are on the ground, and how does that impact any solutions that were halfway through attempting to solve some of these wicked problems? So the enabling environment, the context is always shifting as well. Apart from just having layers of organizations jostling and competing to find solutions, you have a lot going on that you have to consider when you're looking at a particular problem.
Yeah, there are many ways they're a complex system in themselves,
Yes.
aren't
Yes.
they, in the way that they operate, and it's always changing, and governments are changing, and the kind of political forces are always shifting. So PDIA deliberately talks to diffusion from effective practice to the working up things that obviously are working and then leading to locally led reform. Do you think that these institutions are immediately going to respond to this diffusion? How will we get this diffusion to work?
Yeah, PDIA itself is a brilliant concept, I think. Right? In practice, there are challenges in applying it. The systems and structures that are already set up and have been working for years, decades, are not open to experimentation, which is a key component of PDIA, right? So PDIA, you know where you want to go, and you know where you're starting from, and you basically test different approaches and methodologies until you find the solution eventually. Now, I use the word eventually deliberately because you have to recognize that most programs and activities, whether they're in government or NGO, are usually time limited. So there you have your first challenge. You have to show results within, 3.5-year time frame or a 5-year time frame, and you can't really do PDIA in its purest form when you have that kind of restriction. The other problem that you have with implementing PDIA on the ground is people understanding what you're trying to do. The concept of it's okay to fail as long as we know that we're moving forward. And that's very difficult to explain, for example, to donors when you're spending public money, right, towards a particular solution, or for governments to explain that to their citizens, needs some bit of acceptance by the community, by the recipients of the solutions, that this is what we're testing and we don't know whether it's going to work or not, but at least we're moving a step forward. So looking at it from that point of view of PDIA and the practical reality of implementing it on the ground, before we even get to talk about the diffusion of whatever practice is coming out, there's already a huge challenge that has to be overcome in that aspect. People have to understand this process, this methodology, and how it applies. Giving you an example of where I currently work at Compac, the way that we've tried to do this is by creating sort of a performance framework which has very high level goals towards which we are advocating change in. But our position is as a facility to the government, which means we support the government of Indonesia programs towards poverty alleviation in health education or birth certificates and implementation of the village law, which means that having a performance framework is not really understood well, because we are supposed to be responsive to what the government is doing. But by having the performance framework, it not only guides our activities and our discussions with government on what is the right thing to do, but also gives us the opportunity to identify where we can PDIA. Right? So as long as we are comfortable with the government that this is the end goal that we want to reach, they allow us to do a number of activities leading towards that and to write up the lessons and understanding that comes out of implementation. And using that, then we try to diffuse it to various implementing agencies, whether it's at the central or the subnational level government as well. So if you find a good example of, where policy advice has worked or policy dialogue has worked, or a simple technical assistance person approach has worked towards influencing a policy decision, we are going to write that up and try to see if we can replicate that at different levels within the government of Indonesia to affect the change. And that's how we're looking at diffusion.
So what I've heard you just talking now relates, I think, to what in PDIA is called the 3 A's of authority, acceptance, and ability. We'll come back to diffusion in a moment, but can you just talk a little bit more deliberately around those 3 A's of PDIA?
Okay, so these 3 areas basically have to be fulfilled before you can actually attempt a solution, in my opinion. Authority is key, because you have to have authority from both the problem owners and the recipient of the solution. Right? How one understands a problem could be different from how the actual community which faces the problem understands it. Often we've seen this. So we might think that, for example, a lack of birth certificates is a problem in a certain area, but the community really don't feel it as a priority issue. So then it's a problem, and is it a problem, and it's a problem for whom, right? And if it's a problem, are you authorized to actually attempt a solution? An issue like that requires policy discussions and dialogue with government. So is there authority from government for a solution to be attempted on that? Or are there priorities elsewhere? And do you have the authority from the community to actually work on a solution on that? And once you get that authority, the next levels that you have to think about is the solution acceptable? Whatever you're proposing to do for both players that are in this context. So again, on the legal identity example, is the solution acceptable to government? Does it fill the legal framework? Is it sufficient from their point of view? And is the solution acceptable to community? Are they able to access it easily? Is it going to add an additional burden for them to access? For example, you have to think about all that. And the ability is just normal capacity building and institutional strengthening to actually make the solution happen. Solutions tend to work best, in my experience, if there is a champion institution or person, although I like institutions better, who host the solution and ensure its sustainability going into the future, and of course its future evolving. Without having these 3 areas, acceptance, ability, and authority sorted out, it's almost impossible to find a solution that you can put in place and that would work and be sustainable. And when you examine a problem or a solution from these 3 points of view, you might find that while you were thinking that the environment is ready for the solution, maybe you need to invest more in the authority because it doesn't exist. And therefore it creates the opportunity for you to tweak your intervention by adding various blocks to it to either strengthen the acceptance, the ability, or the authority to make it a perfect solution that is sustainable.
I would absolutely agree that unless you have the authority beforehand, there would be very little chance of diffusion occurring back into the government or the provider of that authority. The government is so, we've talked about how complex all this institutional landscape is. So to get authority from all of those players is quite a difficult task. I think you can get authority from a lead agency, but that doesn't, I think, necessarily flow that all of the other agencies involved and organisations will necessarily recognise that authority. So if we want to talk about diffusion, I think there's more sophisticated conceptualisation of how to get that diffusion to work across this crowded institutional landscape.
I think, in my opinion, and I agree completely, right? It's a very complicated, all these issues are very complicated issues to deal with. I mean, and in my view, they're very complicated because they involve human beings, right? You've got to approach these problems keeping in view the mind that you're dealing with human beings, and everyone has different vested interests and different ways of understanding a problem and different ways of accepting solutions, right? The key for me is what is the problem that is being addressed through any intended collaborative efforts, regardless of who the private sector are. If that problem is well understood and it's a key priority for all the players, then it's easier to align the different vested interests. I give you an example from my previous work in trade and transport facilitation. A very simple problem. 45% of the cost of goods in landlocked countries in East Africa is due to transportation costs, right? Now, there are different players here. You've got government, you've got private sector, and you've got civil society, and you've got the community, the consumers. And each one of them is looking at this problem from a different point of view. The government, within the government itself, you've got different players. You've got port authorities, customs authorities, way, bridge and transporters, Ministry of Transport, Ministry of Public Works, and they're all looking at this problem from a different point of view. And they're all trying different interventions to try and bring down this cost. So the Port Authority is busy modernizing in terms of moving containers from the ship and out of the port as fast as possible, because reducing that transaction cost will bring down the cost of part of the 45%. The Revenue Authority, well, is interested in protecting its revenue, also wants goods to move as fast as possible on the transit route so that the transportation bit is also reduced. And you can see just from these two examples, they're looking at the problem from a different point of view. If you pick a single container, the Port Authority's vested interest is to get it down and out. The Revenue Authority's vested interest is to hold it, inspect it, get duties paid of it, and then let it go, right? So already you can see it creates a sort of a conflict there and a tension. And this happens everywhere. So you might have one simple problem, complicated but simple statement of a problem, but when you dive into the actual players and the actual issues that are happening around it, you find that while they share the same concern that they need things to speed up, as in this case, the actual action, mandated action on the ground causes the delays because they're diagonally opposite. Right? One wants to move it faster, one wants to keep it and hold it. So how do you then leverage this vested interest around this problem? Right. The issue is to create an environment where everyone desires and really desires the reduction of the 45% cost to maybe 20%, and therefore direct all their actions, individual actions within their mandates, to make transport as efficient as possible. So while the Port Authority can continue moving goods out of the port, they have to work very closely with the Revenue Authority to make sure that the Revenue Authority is ready to receive those goods and clear them as fast as they're coming out of the port, which means information sharing, data sharing, advanced information systems that tell people which is coming and how to plan for it, joint planning, right? So all these are aspects and activities that can then be put in place to handle that. And then if you think between the Revenue Authority and the actual transporter, there are certain sets of interventions that can be put in place, but not independently. They have to take into account what's already in place between the Port Authority and the Revenue Authority, and so on and so forth. And this reduces the crowding in, because what happens now is the individual solutions that were happening within the port, within the Revenue Authority, are now combined into a broader sort of big picture solution that helps both of them.
So it becomes effectively in their vested interest to collaborate.
Exactly. And if one doesn't collaborate, then it becomes very clear, if you have a very good monitoring and evaluation system around it, where the bottleneck is.
That's very interesting, because often when we talk about institutional collaboration, we'll hear talk of coercion. You know, we'll get the president or the prime minister to force all of these institutions to work together. Or we talk about persuasion. We'll get them all in the room and everyone will be convinced about the importance of this problem and working on it. We don't hear so much about incentives, so, you know, to get into, well, how is it in the vested interest, how is it in the interest of the institution to act, and how can they be rewarded by collaboration? So I think what you've said is very interesting, and it's not how people often approach institutional collaboration.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think I'll talk a little bit more about coercion, but I just want to mention it. A little bit of coercion is necessary, right? Because that's the catalyst. But when you're talking about persuasion, in my experience, where there's a complicated problem that even different government agencies are addressing it from different points of view, the tendency is to show that my solution is best. It's better than yours, so stop doing what you're doing and do what I'm doing. Not recognizing that actually the way the problem is understood on the other side of the fence is quite different from the way I understand it. So you will have these forums where a lot of discussions would be done. I've been in forums where, for example, data was presented that came from two systems about the same transaction, and it was completely different, because one entity wanted to show that they were doing the best job ever, and the other entity wanted to show, no, it is they who are doing the best job ever, and so the problem is on the other side. And you don't get this kind of fruitful discussions from just having forums where you try and just persuade everyone to participate. What I've seen working before is a little bit of coercion. So at the highest level, three presidents in East Africa, Kenya, Uganda, and Rwanda, got together and said, from today, we don't care how we're going to do it, but from today, containers used to take 15 days from the port of Mombasa to the border between Kenya and Uganda, we want that down to 5 days. Right? Go and do it. And the ministries had to come and basically now have to do that. But the coercion is against a very set, specific target that is achievable, right? So what happens then is that order trickles down and people have to fulfill it, because it's a presidential level sort of coercive instruction. You have to do it. And then the collaboration comes into play. How do we work together to make it happen?
So effectively, that's a combination of coercion and incentives and persuasion, is what I've heard you just describe now.
So if that didn't happen, for example, I doubt that there would be the existing collaboration that's happening on the Northern Corridor right now around corridor performance. It wouldn't be there. right? You need someone to set targets and benchmarks and say, okay, this is where the performance should be, and then everyone just reacts to that. That's very, very important, because then there's no excuse for people not to try and achieve those targets. And to be able to do that, then the forums come into play. Put them together in one room to discuss how they're going to achieve those targets. It's no longer, it's persuasion, but it's no longer trying to persuade the person around the counter that we need to do this. That's already done and settled. Now we're discussing like, how are we going to do this? Because we have to, right? And then after that, it becomes easier to streamline. And I think I have a perfect example of where this has worked before, and it's on the Northern Corridor around a project called the Transport Observatory Project. Now this is a corridor monitoring performance tool. Basically what it does is it aggregates data from multiple stakeholders, the Port Authority, Customs, Ministry of Works, Ministry of Roads, Ministry of Transport, and the border authorities, to create a map, a time-stamp map of where every container is, how long it took to pass through various administrative, physical, and documenting checkpoints. And by doing that, for all the import and export goods into East Africa and out of East Africa, you're able to get a very clear snapshot of where the delays are happening. And now what the different stakeholders use this tool for is basically to identify on a weekly basis where the bottlenecks are, and they have a policy discussion every week on who needs to change what. The targets and benchmarks have been set at presidential level, so there are about 7 indicators on a live dashboards that the presidents look at daily, and then you've got about 24 indicators that are monitored on various aspects of the transportation, from the port dwell time to how long it took to transit from the port to the border, and so on and so forth, the types of goods that are moving on the roads, how many were overweight, how many were not overweight. And all this data does is basically allows the entities to take on-the-spot decisions and on-the-spot internal policy decisions. On a quarterly basis, analysis is done through reports on this particular data, and the governments, private sector, and civil society sit together in a forum coordinated through the Northern Corridor Authority to discuss broader policy implications and what needs to change. So, for example, there was an issue once where the Port Authority was working 24 hours, but the border points were working 8 hours. So everything kept piling up at the border, so the two countries had to take policy decisions to change the working hours of different government agencies to be more in line with the flow, and that improved. So such kind of decisions, which are really practical and effective towards keeping the goods flowing, are being taken on a day-to-day basis. But why this worked is because apart from having all the stakeholders working together towards a common vision, which is bringing down the cost of transport in the region and therefore the cost of business, you had an anchor organization which kept it rolling, the Northern Corridor Authority. And you had the coercion from the presidential level, which was basically these are the targets and you have to meet them.
Effectively, you've just laid out all of the ingredients that exist around this method called collective impact, which is, so whether a combination of coercion, persuasion, or incentives, everybody agrees on what the common goal is. And then there are regular meetings, sometimes very frequently, to decide what to do. And then there's a shared measurement system with real-time feedback on progress, and that all of this is facilitated by a backbone organisation, which is somehow has one degree of separation from actually doing the implementation. That's very interesting. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about the shared measurement system, because I think that and I guess also in terms of bringing this all back to PDIA and adaptive practice, where the nature of working on these problems requires a lot of adaptation, and it's always the next step which is really important. So feeding that back into this this institutional collaboration around a shared measurement system and how that can work.
Yeah, no, I think the common monitoring system is probably the most important aspect of any approach like this. Previously, what used to happen in the Transport Observatory example is that the Port Authority would have their statistics department produce their own statistics. These are the number of containers that we serviced this month, this is how fast we serviced them, and so on and so forth. And because they were reporting directly to their line ministry, that report was always, what would I say, painting the perfect picture, right? Like, we're doing good. But the reality on the ground is that there were a lot of delays on the movement of the cargo, and people didn't understand. So the tendency was like, these are our stats, we're doing the best we can, so we are not the problem. And if you talk to different entities, revenue authorities, they would tell you the same thing. We're doing the best that we can, we are not the problem. This was because they had separate monitoring and data systems that were not talking to each other. So it was very difficult for any organizing entity at any level, starting from the Corridor Authority itself. If you go a peg higher, the East African Community Bloc, right, or even a peg higher, the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, they couldn't make any sense of what was happening there because they were looking at these discrete pieces of data which basically said we don't have a problem, but it's apparent that there is a problem. So one of the approaches for the observatory was like, how do we combine all this into a single monitoring system? And it was possible because the administrative data that is already being produced at the port, for example, has container numbers and truck registration numbers. So does the customs system. So does the Ministry of Transport system. And using that, you're able to create a seamless set of all trucks, all goods that are working on the corridor with very minimal effort. So the question then became, how do you make the different stakeholders sign on to this single data set that is fed in from multiple data sets and accept it as the de facto sort of authority and use it to improve their own data, right? And to be honest. And this is where now the persuasion and the coercion comes in. So the Northern Corridor Secretariat has a mandate to monitor corridor performance. They used that to bring the stakeholders together and come into agreement that the data that they give will be combined and fed back to them for quality assurance, and then from then on, it's only that data that would be used for monitoring corridor performance. After that, it was easy because now all the discussions come based on issues and real issues that are evidenced by what the data says. Without the single monitoring system and the data around that, it would have been impossible to bring the coalition together to work on this specific problem.
Thinking maybe thinking about your more recent Indonesian experience. Quite often when we're maybe around the new decentralization that's happening, we often there can be many stakeholders involved, and you don't necessarily want to be collaborating with all of them because they may or may not be very strategic to be collaborating with. So what's your experience of choosing the key stakeholders from what can be quite a large number of stakeholders, and how do you treat different stakeholders in terms of their importance to the problem that you're actually tackling?
This is my own methodology. It's not scientific by any extent, right? But I use it and it works really well. I start from the problem, and the question that I ask is, what's in it for X if we find the solution, right? Because that tells me whether that particular entity X would be willing to engage, right? if they don't see value or they have no vested interest in either the problem or the solution, I mean, those are obvious people that I don't need to engage with because they have no interest in it, right? And once I've grouped these people into the bunch of these have vested interest in the problem or in the solution, the next question I ask is, are they core or are they enabling, right? And what I mean is, are they key actors who would actually work on developing the solution, or are they actors who are enabling the development of the solution? Are they actors within the legal framework, for example? So that gives me also another level of how to know where to structure my initial intervention. And the third thing that I do is apply the authority, ability, and acceptance criteria. So within the stakeholders who really should be working the solution, what's their level of authority? If I were to engage with them, would they be willing to play with, the rest of the gang on this? Have they been authorized to do that at the highest level? And if not, then that's the obvious place to start working on a bilateral relationship with that particular entity. Acceptance, what kind of solutions are they looking at? What's acceptable to them within their framework? And then the ability is the capacity and institutional arrangements that they have. Can they support any solution that emerges out of this, or can we build it? And if you apply that uniformly across all the potential actors you've identified as core and enabling, it becomes very clear what kind of activities and interventions you need to strategically work with them on, and for how long, right? And that's a good starting point always. And then everything after that is PDIA. Yeah.
So we look at that in terms of power influence matrix, and the people that have low interest and low influence over your intended course, they I agree with you, they sort of become the constituents. I mean, you have to maybe just keep them informed so they know what you're doing. And then there'll be the people who have high interest, and they may well be your allies, and there are different ways of getting them to come to the table, but they fundamentally share your concern for the problem and they want to do something about it. But inevitably there are also people who are your opponents. So they may agree that there's a problem, but they may have a totally different solution, or often they may not wish to be taking a process-driven approach, and they may already have the solution and they just want to implement it. Can you talk to how you get those? They're the hard people to get on side. Do you have any experience of dealing with such opponents, and how to persuade them to be more involved in what you're doing?
I think that now comes into the thinking and working politically realm, right? If we really think about it, because most of the opponents of any solution that brings an obvious efficiency to a system or process either have political motivation to stop that from happening, in my experience, or have a vested interest to stop it from happening because they're benefiting from the inefficiencies. And these are really, really big incentives to them to take away from. I have had an example where a solution was reducing cost of doing business, but by doing that was taking away a huge chunk of unnecessary insurance business from someone who was extremely powerful. And that one person was able to stop the activity, right? Because it was impossible to satisfy his vested interests. The only way you could is by not doing the activity, right, and keeping the status quo. So there will always be those kind of cases. And what we tried at that point was to find ways of how that particular person could be convinced that there are alternative options from the solutions for him. It's not what he's used to. Things will change. He might lose there, but he will gain here. And that was sort of like the discussion that we were taking him along. It didn't work, but that was one of the strategies that is very clear in that sense. And that was a highly politically connected person, so it was very easy to stop not just one activity, but an entire portfolio for an entire organization. It's a very tricky situation to work in.
So by engaging the losers in a dialogue, you can minimise the loss and potentially open up other opportunities.
Yes, I think for every solution that is attempted for complex, wicked problems, right, it changes dynamics, it changes systems, processes, and people as well. And there will always be winners and losers when such changes happen. So the trick is to anticipate that and find out how to minimize the loss to the largest extent possible, which means that your solution might have to think of additional activities around it to sort of create opportunities for the losers to benefit from it as well. A good example again is an infrastructure project, any infrastructure project that you pick. Let's say the development of a road. In Africa, if the road is bad, that means vehicles move very slowly, which means there's an opportunity for the women who sell goods by the roadside to catch up with the vehicles and actually sell. And it becomes an economic activity. So the pothole on the road creates an opportunity for people to make money and keep themselves out of poverty. If you build a smooth road, what it means is at a bigger picture level, the cost of business for the region goes down. So the benefits eventually would trickle down to the same person who was selling goods on the road, but it's a long way off. But the opportunity for that person to sell at the road goes away because now trucks don't stop anymore. So when you're thinking about such a project, it's always in your strategic interest to think about what happens to the community around the project, because those becomes the politically charged issues. The local politicians say, we don't want this road because it's going to kill our town, right? How are you going to respond to that? So while your main activity is actually building a road, you have to think of, is it wise to also invest in a market and a truck stop so that actually truckers, because of road safety concerns, can stop there after a long time driving, creates an economic zone, and all these people still benefit. So your project becomes not only a road, it becomes a road, a truck stop, and a market. And you have to think of opportunities like that, even when you're talking about simple, high-level policy decisions. Once you identify who is the potential big loser, right, and are they willing to accept that loss? If they're not, then what else can you build into the intervention to actually cushion it for them? Might make it easier for you to actually get their buy-in into the whole process.
I think often there's a tendency to avoid the opponents. I think your case study, the example you've just given, gives a really good example of the benefits of actually engaging with the people, the opponents, the people that have a vested interest that they're going to lose from, because you can then come up with a more sophisticated response, and maybe those opponents may not be huge allies, but they won't be as aggrieved or as, that it becomes easier for them to accept and maybe even at some point see the benefits. Of course, governments are always looking for the model. Mm-hmm. They're looking for the best practice. So if we get all these things lined up, the PDIA working on a complex problem, and then the institutional collaboration that's coming around that, how do we upscale that? Really, isn't it the process that we want to be upscaling rather than the model or the best practice that seems to be what governments are always looking for so they can create another policy?
I think models and best practices are important because they show what's possible. Right? A lot of the time, solutions to complex, wicked problems, the biggest resistance you get is, well, we can't do that, or it won't give us the value that we think it will. So the best practices and the models sort of prove the concept of whatever solution you're looking for. The process of how you get the models and the best practice is very important, but I would argue that you just can't also just replicate the process. You can't, the contexts are very different in different areas. So picking a best practice and a model from somewhere and expecting it to work elsewhere, I think that has been proven over and over is not something that you would happen 100% of the time, right? Most of the times you have to adjust the model and the best practice to local contexts. So the argument has been that maybe we need to think more about replicating the process itself. But then coming back to what we were discussing earlier about the authority, acceptance, and the ability, these are different also for different kinds of problems and different kinds of collaborations. So what process might have worked for a particular set of actors based on their very specific levels of acceptance, ability, and authority might not work as a process in location B because they're very different in that location. So it's also important to approach the replication of processes cautiously and to look at what the context is on the ground and what aspects can be learned from what has happened elsewhere. So in my opinion, learning from what has worked, whether it's from a model, a best practice, or a process that has been successful, is absolutely where you should start from, and then you apply those lessons to the local context, because the authority, ability, and acceptance is always different.
So you never really get away from having to work it out every time and in every different context. I thought, why is collective action between all of these institutions so critical to locally led reform and adaptive practice?
Very simple, because I think it makes people think outside their comfort zones and outside the box, right? By having to work collectively on a particular policy reform or an issue, it forces people to understand each other's points of view and vested interest. And therefore the solution has to take into account these considerations, which means innovation is fertile there. You can really innovate. Some of the solutions might not be easily implementable because of institutional barriers or legal framework barriers and so on and so forth. So one agency cannot work straightforwardly with another agency, for example. So by them working together on a common problem, they have to innovate around that particular challenge and issue, and this brings out the best in organizations from my experience. That's what I've seen. There are new opportunities arising out of collective impact creating innovation. One of the commonly used terms nowadays is creation of shared value between private sector and public sector. It's not easy for governments to accept private sector solutions for problems that they deem are government problems. By aligning the private sector interest and the public sector interest around a common shared value, not vested interest, shared value, it's easy to create the space to innovate and to find solutions. A recent example that we had in Indonesia was around bringing a very well-known e-learning platform in Indonesia with a government ministry around capacity building and training around Indonesia. Vested interest for the private sector was, of course, to roll out the platform and to make profit. For the ministry, it was to lower down the costs of doing this capacity building, get data and statistics to better target the training and curriculum instead of applying a one-size-fits-all training. And the shared value was basically a project that enabled both of them to get their vested interests fulfilled, which is basically a project around training of officials of that ministry all the way from the central level to the village level. And everyone wins in that context. But this is an example of how innovative opportunities and more sustainable approaches on solutions can come out of collective impact. That's really, to me, the importance of it all.
These exciting challenges, aren't they? Thank you very much, Athman. That's been fantastic.
Okay, thank you so much, Mark.